Miss Marple and the Quiet Death of a Brilliant Boy. Chapter 1. Rain, Tea, and a Letter. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the neat little cottage on the corner of the High Street in St. Mary Mead. The sky outside was a dull grey, and the roses in Miss Marple's front garden drooped with the weight of the water. Inside, however, all was warm and orderly. The clock ticked gently on the mantelpiece. The fire crackled. And in her favourite high-back chair by the window, Miss Marple sat with a basket of mending in her lap. Though well past the age when most would surrender to quiet retirement, Miss Marple had never truly ceased to observe, to notice things, and to think. Her knitting needle paused mid-air as the front door opened, and familiar footsteps echoed through the hall. "Miss Marple," came the cheery voice of Ethel, the maid. "I'm back, and I've brought your tea." Miss Marple looked up and smiled, genuinely pleased. "Ah, Ethel, there you are. Do come in. You've been missed." Ethel entered the sitting room, cheeks slightly flushed from the damp outside, her apron neat and her hair freshly pinned. She placed the tray on the table and poured a cup with practiced ease, then set it down before Miss Marple, who took it with a grateful nod. "Well now," Miss Marple said, adjusting her spectacles, "how were your days at your sister's?" 5 years, was it, since you last saw her?" Ethel nodded, her face brightening. "Yes, miss, 5 long years. It was ever so good to see her again. We talked till late into the night like we used to when we were girls." "That sounds lovely," Miss Marple said kindly, sipping her tea. Ethel pulled a stool closer to the hearth and sat, eyes momentarily distant with memory. "She's not changed much, my sister. But oh, her boy Lucas, what a fine young man he's grown into. Bright as anything, miss, always top of his class. His teachers say he's bound for great things. Wants to be a doctor, he does." Miss Marple's smile deepened, and she set down her cup. "That's wonderful to hear. So few young men these days seem to have such noble aspirations. A doctor, you say? Well, I shall certainly say a prayer for his success." "Thank you, miss," Ethel said, her voice touched with emotion. "It means a lot." After a moment's pause, Ethel stood. "Shall I pop down to the market for a few things, miss? We're nearly out of sugar and butter." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, dear. But do take your umbrella, because the rain hasn't let up." Ethel wrapped herself in her coat and left with a cheerful, "Back in a tick." The door clicked shut behind her, and Miss Marple returned to her mending, though her thoughts lingered briefly on the image of the young man Lucas, brimming with promise. It wasn't long before the knock came at the front door, a brisk, familiar rap. She rose and opened it to find the village postman, Mr. Dent, standing in his rubber cape and cap, water dripping from the brim. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, doffing his cap slightly. "Still well, I hope?" "Well enough," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "You're braving this dreadful rain, I see." "Can't let the mail wait," he said with a grin, "though today it's not for you, ma'am. It's for your maid Ethel." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Oh, she's just gone to the market. Leave it with me. I'll see that she gets it." The postman handed over the envelope, nodded politely, and vanished into the wet. Miss Marple returned to her chair, placed the letter gently on the tea tray, and continued her quiet work. About half an hour later, Ethel returned, her cheeks now flushed from walking, and the basket in her arm filled with parcels. She set it down in the kitchen before joining Miss Marple in the sitting room. "You had a letter," Miss Marple said, motioning to the tray. "Oh!" Ethel took it up quickly, her brows knitting together. "From my sister." She broke the seal, unfolded the paper, and began to read. Miss Marple, already sensing a shift in the air, quietly set down her sewing. Ethel's lips trembled, her eyes widened, the color drained from her face, A choked sound escaped her, and before Miss Marple could speak, Ethel let out a sob and crumpled into the nearest chair, the letter falling from her hand like a withered leaf. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, rising and crossing to her side. "What's happened?" Ethel tried to speak, but no words came, only the quiet gasping of someone who had just had the wind knocked from their soul. Miss Marple picked up the letter and read it, her face slowly turning grave. It was brief, barely a few lines. Written by Ethel's sister in a hand made unsteady by grief. "Ethel, I don't know how to write this. Lucas is gone. He took his own life yesterday afternoon. I found him in his room. I am lost. Please come if you can. Love." Margaret. Miss Marple stood silent for a moment, the weight of the letter heavy in her hands. Outside, the rain continued to fall, a mournful rhythm against the glass. She knelt beside Ethel and placed a steady hand on her arm. "I'm so sorry, dear." Ethel could only shake her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. After a few minutes, Miss Marple spoke again, her voice calm but resolute. "This doesn't sit right with me, Ethel. Not a boy like that. Bright, determined, full of hope. No, something is not as it seems." Ethel looked up, eyes red and puffy but filled with a flicker of understanding. "I'll come with you," Miss Marple said firmly. "To your sister's. We'll go together, and I shall see for myself what really happened to young Lucas." Outside, the clouds hung low, and the wind whispered through the village streets. But inside the cottage, something had stirred in Miss Marple. That quiet instinct, the sense that behind a tragedy, a mystery had begun to unfold. And Miss Marple, though gentle and unassuming in appearance, had solved too many such puzzles to ignore the feeling that not all was as it should be. She looked out the window, watching the garden blur in the rain, and murmured, almost to herself, "Boys like Lucas don't simply vanish into the dark." Not without a reason. And she would find that reason, no matter how deep it was buried. Chapter 2. A Note and a Doubt. The rain had slowed to a fine drizzle by the time Miss Marple and Ethel reached the quiet lane where Ethel's sister lived. A faint mist clung to the hedgerows, and a hushed stillness blanketed the neighborhood, interrupted only by the murmurs of a small group gathered outside the modest brick house. Their faces bore the same stunned expression, a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Ethel clutched Miss Marple's arm tightly as they approached the door. The old lady, though small and fragile-looking, walked with steady resolve. A constable stood guard by the entrance and stepped aside upon recognizing the women. Inside, the house was dim and heavy with grief. A low sob could be heard from the kitchen, where Ethel's sister Margaret sat, slumped at the table, a handkerchief crumpled in her hand. Ethel broke away from Miss Marple and hurried to her. "Margaret!" The two sisters embraced, and for a few moments, Miss Marple gave them their privacy. She looked around the narrow hallway. The wallpaper faded, a coat hanging neatly on a peg, a pair of school shoes tucked beneath the umbrella stand. Signs of life, of routine, of a child who no longer lived. Soon, an officer emerged from one of the rooms. "Miss Marple, is it?" "Inspector Graves," he said, nodding courteously. "You're here with the maid, yes?" "I am," Miss Marple said calmly. "I heard about the boy. My deepest sympathies." The inspector gave a tired sigh. "Tragic business. Very sad." "May I see the room?" she asked gently. He hesitated, then nodded. "It's as it was. The doctor insisted nothing be touched until the post-mortem is complete." Miss Marple stepped carefully into the small bedroom. Lucas's lifeless body lay on the bed, covered now with a sheet. His spectacles rested on the bedside table beside a half-finished library book. A study desk stood in the corner, neatly arranged. On the floor, a glass lay overturned, a small detail yet oddly significant. Miss Marple noticed that nothing seemed disturbed, no signs of struggle, no frantic disorder. The room was as a studious boy might have left it, save for the terrible stillness that now haunted it. The inspector stepped beside her. He took poison, the doctor says. Likely ingested in that glass. What kind of poison? She asked. Too early to tell. We'll know once the report's back from the lab. For now, all we have is the note. He handed her a piece of paper. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read the message aloud under her breath. Today, I am very sad. That is why I am going to end my life. She turned the page over. This is only half a sheet. No date, no signature. Rather, incomplete, don't you think? The inspector shrugged. Sometimes these notes aren't thought through, just a last-minute impulse. But this doesn't sound impulsive, Miss Marple murmured. It sounds scripted. Graves folded his arms. We already checked the handwriting. Matches his class notebook exactly. The boy was alone in the room, no sign of forced entry. His mother found him like this an hour ago. She said he was devastated this morning. Today was the day exam results came out. Ethel's voice piped in from the hallway. Lucas always topped his class. He dreamed of being a doctor. Yes, but not this time, said Graves. He failed his English paper, received the lowest marks in the class. That dropped his overall rank. Miss Marple furrowed her brow. That's troubling, yes? But for a bright boy like Lucas to take his life over a single poor grade, there's a disconnect. Graves sighed. Sometimes pressure builds up. You know how children are these days. Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Did he have any enemies at school? Was he being bullied? Was anyone aware of his distress? Graves hesitated. That would be something for his school to confirm. But his mother didn't mention anything like that. Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the glass on the floor. Was this tested for fingerprints? Not yet, Graves admitted. As I said, we'll wait for the post-mortem. I understand, she replied. But even before the report arrives, we can begin piecing together his state of mind, perhaps speak to his teachers, schoolmates, and see if anything seems off. Poison is a painful way to die, and Lucas doesn't seem the type to make rash decisions. If he really did take this route, something must have deeply disturbed him. I can allow preliminary questioning, said the inspector. But unless something concrete turns up, we'll have to close it as suicide. The writing matches, and his family recognizes it. Miss Marple nodded slowly but said nothing. Later that afternoon, while Ethel remained with her sister, Miss Marple requested to see Lucas's belongings. With Inspector Graves's reluctant approval, she was granted access to the boy's school bag and books. She opened one of his English notebooks and compared the handwriting. Yes, it was indeed similar. But Miss Marple had examined many a forgery in her time, and one thing struck her immediately. The rhythm of the strokes in the suicide note was inconsistent, almost hesitant. The natural ease of a child's writing, especially one used to journaling and note-taking, was missing. She tapped the page gently and whispered, No child writes like this when he is in pain. She also noticed that the desk drawers were meticulously arranged, pencils in one, erasers in another, paperclips sorted by size. A methodical child, organized. That didn't align with the emotional chaos often associated with suicide. In one corner of the drawer, she found a scrap of folded paper, a practice essay for English. Lucas had written, Failure does not define us, it teaches us. From every mistake, a lesson. From every stumble, a path forward. Miss Marple read it twice, then placed it carefully back. She returned to the inspector. He wrote that just days ago, she said softly. Does that sound like a boy who would poison himself over poor marks? Graves looked thoughtful. No, it doesn't. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Inspector, I believe someone wanted us to think Lucas took his own life, but if we dig deeper, speak to the teachers, review who had access to the house, who knew he was home alone, we may find that this was no suicide. The inspector exhaled slowly, the weight of uncertainty beginning to press in. Very well, Miss Marple. We'll begin preliminary questioning, but until the report comes in, we're only speculating. Sometimes, Miss Marple said quietly, speculation is where the truth begins. And with that, the wheels of inquiry began to turn. Outside, the clouds were finally beginning to break, but the storm surrounding Lucas's death had only just begun. Chapter 3. Grief and Questions. The drawing room of the modest village home was dimly lit, the curtains drawn against the grey afternoon light. The scent of tea and old wood mingled faintly with the heaviness of sorrow. Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, her hands gently clasped, her gaze calm but alert. Around her the air was thick with silence and grief. She had called them all into the room, not as an investigator in the formal sense, but as someone who had come to understand over many years that tragedies often concealed truths too painful to be easily spoken. Lucas's mother, Margaret, sat on the edge of the floral settee, her face pale and damp with tears, her hands twisted a handkerchief in her lap. Lucas's father, a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Henry, stood rigid near the window, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The uncle and aunt sat close together on the other side of the room, their expressions somber. But it was Abigail, young, delicate, and visibly shaken, who sobbed most uncontrollably. She held her knees close, her shoulders trembling with each breath. Outside the room, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of Ethel crying quietly in the hallway. Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle a moment longer, letting the family feel their grief. Then, with a gentle nod to the inspector beside her, she said quietly, "Perhaps we can begin by asking a few questions. Henry, if you'd be so kind as to stay a moment. The rest, if you'd please give us a little privacy." One by one, the others stood and stepped outside, leaving only Henry, Miss Marple, and Inspector Graves. Miss Marple turned to Lucas's father. "Mr. Winton," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I understand this is a terrible time, but the smallest detail can help us understand what happened to Lucas. Would you tell me where you were when he passed?" Henry Winton rubbed the back of his neck and exhaled heavily. "I run a hardware shop in the village. That morning, I had breakfast with my wife and Lucas, just like usual. I knew he was expecting his school results that day, but I had a busy delivery coming in. I left straight after breakfast and didn't come back until I got the news." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "So, you weren't home when Lucas returned from school?" "No," Henry replied. "I was at the shop all day. My assistant Dean can confirm that." "Of course," Miss Marple said softly. "And when you left in the morning, how did Lucas seem?" Henry frowned, thinking. "Quiet. But that wasn't unusual. He was always a bit shy, thoughtful, especially on days when something important was coming up, like his results." "Did he say anything about being nervous, or about not doing well?" Henry shook his head. "Not a word. If anything, I thought he was confident." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Inspector Graves, then gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Winton. That will be all for now." Henry turned and left the room slowly, shoulders slightly hunched. Miss Marple gestured for Margaret to enter. Lucas's mother walked in with hesitating steps, her eyes red and tired. She sat on the very edge of the armchair as though afraid to settle. "Mrs. Winton," Miss Marple began gently, "I know this is hard, but it's important we understand everything we can. Tell me, what happened when Lucas came home?" Margaret wiped her nose and took a shaky breath. "He walked in without saying a word. I asked him about his result, but he didn't answer, just went straight to his room. He looked pale, like he was holding back tears. What did you do then?" "I followed him, but he shut the door. I didn't want to press him, so I went to the kitchen to make him something to eat. I thought he'd feel better after a meal." Her voice faltered. "I made his favorite, potato cakes and eggs." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "And then?" "I took the plate upstairs about 20 minutes later. I knocked. No answer. I opened the door and he was on the floor, near his bed. I dropped the plate and ran to him. But he was cold. I tried to lift him." Her words dissolved into tears. Miss Marple moved to her side and offered a tissue. "Thank you, my dear. You're very brave. Just one more question. Was there anyone else in the house that morning?" Margaret shook her head. "No one. Ethel was still away at her sister's. Just me and Lucas." Miss Marple stood and walked slowly to the desk near the corner of the room. She ran a finger lightly over its surface, thoughtful. Back in the hallway, the rest of the family remained in quiet conversation. Though Abigail had now moved to a chair by the window, her face turned away. Miss Marple whispered to the inspector as they stepped out of the room. "Something feels off." Graves looked puzzled. "How so?" "She says Lucas looked pale when he came home. But Henry says he was fine when he left. That's less than 2 hours apart. And a boy with high intelligence and deep discipline, like Lucas, doesn't spiral from hopeful to suicidal that quickly, unless something truly distressing happened." "You think something else caused it?" "I don't think, not yet," Miss Marple replied. "But I intend to find out." She turned her gaze toward Abigail, who sat still, her hands tightly clenched in her lap. "And I'd very much like to speak to the cousin next." As Miss Marple moved toward her, the rain began again outside, light at first, then steady. But inside the house, a storm of another kind had just begun to stir. Chapter 4. A shift in position. The wind rattled the ivy outside the windows as Miss Marple sat once more in the small parlor, her hands calmly folded in her lap, her eyes alert behind her spectacles. The room had emptied and refilled several times over the past hour as family members were questioned one by one. Now, with most of the initial statements reviewed, she and Inspector Graves turned to the remaining relatives. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Charles Winton next," Miss Marple said, referring to Lucas's uncle. Charles entered the room wearing a neatly pressed shirt and the exhausted look of a man shaken by tragedy. He took his seat across from Miss Marple and the inspector, his expression respectful, if slightly guarded. "I understand this is difficult," Miss Marple began gently, "but we're asking each family member the same question. Where were you this morning, around the time Lucas passed away?" Charles nodded slowly. "I work at Lloyd's Bank. I left home around 8:30 this morning, and was there when I got the call. I came straight back. You can verify that with the bank manager." Inspector Graves scribbled something in his notepad, and Miss Marple continued, "Were you aware Lucas was receiving his results today?" "Yes," Charles replied. "He mentioned it at dinner last night. We all knew it was important to him." "Did he seem nervous or upset?" she asked. Charles paused. "He was quiet, but Lucas was always a thoughtful boy. I wouldn't say he looked anxious. More focused, perhaps." Miss Marple gave a soft nod and glanced at Graves, who dismissed Charles with a polite thank you. Next came Mrs. Winton, Charles's wife and Lucas's aunt. She entered looking flustered, smoothing the sleeves of her cardigan as she sat down. Her grief showed differently, held in but tightly coiled behind her pale face. Mrs. Winton, Miss Marple began, you also live here in the house. May I ask where you were at the time Lucas passed? I didn't go to school today, she said quickly. I teach at the same school as Lucas, but I wasn't well this morning. I stayed home, in my room. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. So you didn't attend school at all today, even though it was result day? No, she said, a bit more defensively. I informed the school. I had a terrible headache and thought it best to rest. I see, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. That would mean you were home when Lucas returned. I was in my room, she replied. I didn't see him, but I heard Margaret, his mother, crying. That's when I went to his room and saw what had happened. And that was the first moment you realized something was wrong? Miss Marple asked gently. Yes, she said. Absolutely. Miss Marple nodded politely. Thank you. That will be all for now. As the aunt left the room, the tension in the house grew more apparent. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to emerge, but nothing quite fit together. Then Miss Marple asked for Abigail. The girl entered hesitantly, her cheeks blotchy from tears, her eyes still brimming. She sat with her arms folded tight across her body, as if trying to hold herself together. Abigail, dear, Miss Marple said softly, I know this is very difficult for you. I won't ask more than I must. Abigail nodded slowly. You and Lucas were in the same class at school, is that right? Yes, Abigail whispered. We've always been in the same class. And today, Miss Marple continued, your results were released. May I ask how you performed? Abigail wiped at her nose with a tissue and said, I came first. That's wonderful, Miss Marple said gently. And what about last year? Abigail hesitated, glancing at the inspector, then back at Miss Marple. Last year I was second. Lucas came first. I see, Miss Marple said, her voice even. And do you know why Lucas didn't come first this time? Abigail looked down at her lap. He didn't do well in his English paper. His marks were low. Too low to keep his position. That's how I came first. There was silence in the room for a moment. Then Miss Marple asked, was Lucas upset about the results? Did he say anything to you? Abigail's lips trembled. He looked shocked. But he didn't speak to me after the results were announced. He just left. Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair. Did you notice anything strange today? Anything out of the ordinary? Abigail hesitated again. No, I don't think so. Miss Marple offered a kind smile. You've been very helpful, Abigail. Thank you. As the girl left the room, Inspector Graves turned to Miss Marple. Well, anything stand out? Yes, Miss Marple replied quietly. Quite a few things. She rose from her seat and walked slowly toward the window, the rain now only a fine mist across the glass. Lucas's uncle was at work. Well, that seems credible. His aunt says she stayed home ill, yet she didn't hear anything until the mother cried out. Curious, don't you think? Graves nodded. Possibly. And Abigail, Miss Marple continued, was quite clear that Lucas's low marks led to her gaining the top position. But what caught my attention was her hesitation, the way she responded only after carefully considering her words. You think she's hiding something? Graves asked. I think she knows more than she's said, Miss Marple replied. And then there's this. Lucas's aunt is a teacher at the same school. She should have been there on such an important day. Yet she stayed home, in the very house where Lucas died, but claims to have heard nothing until it was too late. You think she saw something? Graves asked. I think it's possible she saw more than she let on. Or perhaps someone else was in the house she didn't mention. The inspector furrowed his brow. You're suggesting someone else may have had access? Miss Marple turned from the window and adjusted her shawl. All I'm suggesting, Inspector, is that we're only beginning to uncover the truth. And in my experience, truth has a way of hiding in plain sight. Graves looked at her with a mix of admiration and caution. What do you want to do next? Miss Marple's eyes sparkled just slightly. I'd like to visit the school tomorrow, speak with the teachers, perhaps even look at the marked papers, especially Lucas's English exam. I have a feeling the answer to all this may be written between the lines. The inspector nodded. I'll make the arrangements. As Miss Marple sat back down, her thoughts already turning, the mist outside thickened. But inside, the shadows had begun to take shape, and she was determined to chase them down. Chapter 5. Broken locks and muddy clues. The house was beginning to quiet. The initial rush of panic had faded into a tense stillness, like the final hush after a thunderstorm. Miss Marple, never one to overlook a detail, stepped out of the rear hallway and into the narrow passage that led toward the back of the house. The inspector followed closely, his notebook in hand, but mostly forgotten. It was then that Miss Marple paused at the back door. The wooden frame was slightly ajar, and upon closer inspection, the lock was clearly damaged. The wood around it was splintered, not from weather or age, but from deliberate force. She turned the handle gently. This door opens to the garden? Yes, replied Inspector Graves, stepping up beside her. We hadn't considered it earlier. Most of our attention was focused on the front of the house. But this... He frowned and leaned forward. The lock is broken. Could someone have entered through here, perhaps, to poison the boy? Miss Marple examined the frame carefully, her fingers lightly touching the fractured wood. Then she knelt down, examining the broken pieces and the lock's orientation. No, she said, with quiet certainty. This lock was forced from the inside, not the outside. Graves looked at her, surprised. Are you sure? She nodded. Quite sure. Look at the way the splinters face inward. The door wasn't pushed open from the outside, it was broken from within. Someone was either trying to create the impression of forced entry, or perhaps panicked and broke the lock, trying to get out. The inspector turned and looked out at the garden. The ground was still soft from the earlier rain, and the flower beds that bordered the narrow stone path were thick with muddy soil. And the garden? Miss Marple asked, following his gaze. Graves stepped out and walked a few paces, his boots squishing slightly in the wet ground. There aren't any footprints, he confirmed. At least none that aren't clearly old. Miss Marple joined him, careful to step only on the stones. Exactly my point, she said. If someone had entered or exited through this door today, especially after the rain, they would have left at least one print in the soil. But there's nothing fresh, not a single mark. This was not the route of an intruder. So the poison wasn't administered by anyone sneaking in from the garden, Graves said slowly. It must have come from someone inside the house. Miss Marple gave him a knowing glance. Or someone who had access to the house without forcing their way in. Either way, the idea of an outside attacker is growing increasingly unlikely. The inspector frowned, deep in thought. That narrows things down, but it still leaves us with several possible suspects, or all family, or at least close. Miss Marple clasped her hands. Yes, and that makes motive all the more important now. This wasn't just a tragic moment of panic or pressure. If Lucas was murdered, someone close to him had something to gain. Graves nodded slowly. And we still have that exam result, the supposed reason for his suicide. Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. Exactly. Which is why I think it's time we visit Lucas's school. Do you think the answer lies there? I think it might tell us what really happened with those results. And if Lucas's score was tampered with, then we may find ourselves with both motive and method. The inspector gave a short nod. I'll arrange for us to speak with the headmaster and Lucas's teachers. As they walked back into the house, Miss Marple paused once more by the back door, looking at the broken lock. A small, quiet detail, easily overlooked, yet telling a story all its own. Someone had wanted it to seem like Lucas's death came from the outside, but Miss Marple was certain now. The danger had always been within. Chapter 6. The Paper Trail. The next morning dawned damp and grey, the mist clinging low over the hedges as Miss Marple and Inspector Graves made their way to Lucas's school. It was a modest brick building, nestled between chestnut trees, its iron gate just beginning to show signs of rust. The rain had left puddles in the yard, and the hallways smelled faintly of chalk, ink, and polished wood. They were shown into the principal's office, a cramped space lined with books, certificates, and a large, ticking wall clock. Mr. Pembroke, the principal, stood as they entered. A kind-faced man in his late 50s, he looked both tired and thoughtful. Miss Marple, Inspector, he greeted them. Terrible business, this. Absolutely terrible. Yes, Miss Marple replied, taking a seat opposite his desk. We understand Lucas was quite an exceptional student. One of our brightest, Pembroke said, sighing. Polite, precise, always diligent. That's why the result came as such a shock. You were surprised? Asked the inspector, notebook ready. Very much so, Pembroke said. When I saw that Lucas had lost his top position, I immediately asked our coordinator what had happened. He said Lucas had scored extremely low in his English paper, far below his usual standard. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Who is the English teacher? Pembroke hesitated. Mrs. Winton, Lucas's aunt. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Interesting. She didn't mention that to us when we questioned her. No, Pembroke said, raising his brows. She's been teaching English here for years. I assumed you knew. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her thoughts moving rapidly. Then she asked, would it be possible for me to see Lucas's English exam paper? Of course, Pembroke replied. He stood and unlocked a nearby cabinet, rifling through a series of folders. Within moments, he handed her a neatly stapled exam booklet with Lucas's name in the corner. Miss Marple turned the pages slowly, her eyes scanning each answer. Lucas's handwriting was as neat and confident as ever, but the markings, red crosses and harsh underlines, painted a very different picture. This seems unusually harsh, she murmured. The essay structure is sound. His grammar, for the most part, is correct. These deductions, they feel rather forced. The inspector glanced over her shoulder. Can you tell how many marks he lost? Far more than warranted, she said. This isn't a failing paper by any fair standard. Miss Marple looked up at the principal. May I also see the papers or notebooks of some other students? Perhaps 5 from the same class? Certainly, Aunt, he said. Come with me. Together they walked down the corridor to Lucas's classroom. The desks were arranged in neat rows, a blackboard still smudged with chalk notes from the previous lesson. Miss Marple selected 5 notebooks at random from the shelf by the teacher's desk. As she flipped through them, her suspicions deepened. These students made more grammatical mistakes than Lucas, and yet their papers have fewer deductions. She handed one of the notebooks to the inspector. This student used a run-on sentence, misused 2 tenses, and still received higher marks than Lucas. Graves frowned. You think the grading was manipulated? I believe it's a strong possibility, Miss Marple said. Deliberately lowering Lucas's score could have cost him his top position. Something that might have mattered to someone in this school, or even this family. As they returned to the hallway, the inspector turned to her. I'm going to the hospital now. The post-mortem report should be ready. Will you return to Lucas's house? Miss Marple nodded. Yes. There's something I'd like to look at again. And perhaps speak to Abigail once more. The inspector adjusted his coat. Let's meet back at the Winton house in an hour. Miss Marple lingered in the school courtyard for a moment, her hand resting lightly on Lucas's exam booklet. There was something disturbingly personal about the red ink scrawled across the pages. A cruelty that didn't match any academic standard, but rather a private intent. Someone, she thought, had tampered with Lucas's future. And perhaps, just perhaps, that tampering had turned deadly. She stepped through the school gate, her steps steady, her resolve quietly growing. The truth, she knew, was rarely far from the surface. And this time, it might be written in more than just ink. Chapter 7. The Truth in the Ink. The rain had returned by late afternoon, falling in steady whispers against the windows of the Winton household. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted, no longer thick with raw grief alone, but tense with anticipation. Miss Marple, having returned from the school with a file under her arm, quietly requested Ethel to provide her a private space. I just need a quiet room, she said. There's something I must examine closely. Ethel nodded and led her to a small study at the back of the house, where dust-lined bookshelves and an unused writing desk awaited. Miss Marple set down her materials, Lucas's English exam paper, 5 students' notebooks, and the carefully selected clues she'd gathered from the classroom, and began to read. Her eyes, though old, were sharp and steady. A little while later, the door creaked open. Inspector Graves entered holding a brown envelope marked confidential. He didn't need to speak. One look at his face told her everything. The post-mortem? She asked. He nodded solemnly. Arsenic, he said. Found in Lucas's stomach lining. Traces in his bloodstream, ingested, likely in liquid form, hours before his death. Miss Marple closed the notebook in front of her, folded her hands on the desk, and said in a voice that brooked no resistance, Gather everyone in the house. Now. Minutes later, the family, still pale, still stricken, was assembled in the drawing room. Lucas's mother sat closest to the fire, her hands shaking slightly. Henry Winton, his father, stood with his arms crossed, expression unreadable. Charles and his wife, Lucas's aunt and uncle, sat side by side. Abigail clung to a crumpled handkerchief, eyes swollen from crying. Ethel hovered near the doorway, her presence as steady as ever. Miss Marple entered slowly, carrying a stack of papers in one hand. She remained standing, her presence commanding. Before we begin, she said, I must tell you that the post-mortem confirms Lucas did not die by his own hand. He was poisoned with arsenic. A murmur ran through the room. Margaret let out a quiet gasp. This, Miss Marple continued, holding up Lucas's English exam paper, is the paper that supposedly caused his disgrace. I reviewed it carefully. The answers marked wrong by his teacher are in fact correct. She turned to Lucas's aunt, her tone gentle but firm. You are his English teacher, are you not? Lucas's aunt shifted in her seat. Yes, but I marked according to the school's guidelines. If there was an error... Miss Marple raised a hand. I thought you might say that. That's why I brought comparison notebooks from other students in Lucas's class. She handed one to the inspector and held another open for the room to see. Here, a student makes multiple grammatical mistakes, but receives full marks for this section. And here, she flipped through another. A paragraph with spelling errors is not marked down at all. In fact, none of the students were marked as harshly as Lucas. She paused, then turned to Abigail. You said you came first this year because Lucas did poorly, didn't you? Abigail nodded nervously. Yes, that's what the results showed. Miss Marple nodded, then took a slow step forward. Now let's look at these same students' handwriting practice pages. Each one, and I do mean each, has a suicide note written in it, assigned as a class exercise, no doubt. Lucas's aunt paled. It was just an exercise, a dramatic writing prompt. I see, Miss Marple said. Curious, though, that Lucas's notebook is the only one with the suicide note missing. She pulled it from her pile and showed the torn edge, where a page had clearly been ripped out. Miss Marple turned back to the group. The suicide note found near Lucas's body was written in his hand, but it was copied from a previous class assignment, one assigned by you. She looked directly at Lucas's aunt. You tore the top part of the page in the portion that bore the original date, so it wouldn't be questioned. But the handwriting lacks emotional context. The pressure on the pen, the uneven strokes, all indicate it was written under direction, not in despair. Lucas's aunt was silent. Miss Marple stepped closer. And on the day Lucas died, result day, you were mysteriously absent from school. You told us you were ill, but when I searched your room earlier, I found no medication, no doctor's note, no signs of any illness. There was silence. The room held its breath. You weren't sick, Miss Marple said softly. You were here because you knew what you had done. You failed Lucas deliberately. You destroyed his chance of coming first. And when you feared he might say something, you poisoned him. I didn't. Lucas's aunt began, her voice cracking. You did, Miss Marple interrupted gently. And you used arsenic. A poison not easy to acquire, not one a child could simply stumble upon, a calculated choice. One meant to mimic a desperate act. Margaret sobbed quietly in the corner. Abigail stared wide-eyed. But why? Inspector Graves finally asked. Miss Marple turned to him. Jealousy, competition, perhaps even resentment. Lucas was bright, brighter perhaps than someone in his own family could tolerate. She tampered with his result, stripped him of his position, and when she feared exposure, acted to silence him permanently. Chapter 8. A Quiet Farewell. The drawing room, once echoing with sobs and tension, had fallen into a stunned silence. Lucas's aunt sat slumped in the armchair, her face pale, her hands trembling as she stared into nothing. The confession had come almost in a whisper, fragile but final. The truth, long buried beneath resentment and rivalry, had risen to the surface at last. Yes, she had said, voice cracking under the weight of her own words. Yes, I gave him the poison. The words hung heavy in the air. I hated him, she continued, her voice barely audible. Abigail. She worked so hard. She studied late, asked questions, tried to improve. But it was never enough. No matter what she did, Lucas always came first. He was brilliant without even trying. And the way the family looked at him, admiration, pride, affection, all of it was his. Never hers. The others remained frozen in place. Abigail's tear-streaked face twisted in disbelief and horror. Mum, no, she whispered. You didn't. Her mother looked at her then for the first time in minutes. I did it for you, she said, eyes brimming with tears. I wanted you to have what you deserved. Just once. Across the room, Miss Marple stood by the fireplace, watching the tragic scene unfold with quiet dignity. Her voice, when it came, was soft but steady. But you misunderstood your daughter, she said. Abigail admired Lucas. She was proud of him, not bitter. She looked up to him. Lucas's aunt shook her head slowly. She was too good to admit how much it hurt. Every time his name was praised, every time his marks were displayed on the wall, I saw the way she looked down at her feet. "No," Abigail said firmly now, stepping forward. "You saw what you wanted to see. I never hated him. He was my cousin, my friend. I never wanted this." Miss Marple looked from mother to daughter with a sadness that seemed to stretch back through decades of witnessing similar pain. "Hatred, Mrs. Winton, is not born in children. It grows in adults who cannot accept that love, talent, and attention can be shared. You could have lifted Abigail up. Instead, you took Lucas down." At that moment, Inspector Graves stepped forward and gave a small nod to the constable standing at the door. "We'll need to take her into custody," he said quietly. A moment later, a lady constable entered. She moved toward Lucas's aunt, her tone professional, but not unkind. "Mrs. Winton, you'll need to come with us." There was no resistance. The woman stood, shoulders stooped, and allowed herself to be escorted out of the room without a word. The quiet sound of her footsteps down the hall was the only noise as the family remained seated in stunned silence. As the front door closed behind them, Miss Marple turned to Ethel, who stood by her sister, offering quiet support. Margaret had not spoken since the confession. Her eyes stared into her lap, empty and grieving. Miss Marple approached Ethel gently. "You've done your part, dear. Stay here now. Be with your sister. She'll need you." Ethel nodded, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything." Miss Marple offered her a kind smile. Truth has a way of finding light even through the darkest cracks. She turned to leave, picking up her coat and handbag from the stand near the door. The rain outside had slowed, now just a faint drizzle against the evening sky. She opened the door and for a moment paused at the threshold. Looking back, she saw the remnants of a family broken, but now facing something real. Something true. There was no comfort in what had been uncovered, no sense of victory. Only the quiet dignity of knowing that justice, however painful, had been served. She stepped into the rain, her footsteps soft on the wet path. Behind her, the Winton house would begin to mourn properly now, not just for the boy they had lost, but for the innocence that had died with him. Miss Marple, walking slowly down the lane, let the wind tug at her shawl. Another tragedy behind her, another truth uncovered, but still she felt the weight of it. Lucas had been a bright boy, full of promise, and he had deserved better than to be envied by someone who should have been his guide, his teacher, his family. She reached the corner where the road curved toward St. Mary Mead. Her cottage, quiet and waiting, stood at the edge of the village with its familiar ivy-covered walls and warm light in the window. As she neared home, she took one last glance behind her, toward the path from which she'd come. "Rest now, child," she murmured under her breath. "You are seen, you are known." And with that, Miss Marple stepped inside, closed the door gently behind her, and returned to her armchair, the place where all her cases began and where they would always end. In reflection, not in glory.